Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Dear students, you're welcome back to the e-learning portal of SS3E College, Ibadan. This is the economics class for SS3 for week 4, lesson 2, presented by Aderogba. The topic is still the nature of the Nigerian economy. We started at the last class by having an overview of the economy, and then we also looked at the general performance of the economy. Today, inshallah, we shall be looking at the structure of the Nigerian economy. The Nigerian economy is divided into three sectors. The primary sector, which is made up of the agriculture industry, the oil and gas, the mining, and the forestry. We have the secondary sector, which is made up of the manufacturing and the construction company. And we have the tertiary sector, which is made up of services, the professional and commercial services. For further analysis, the Nigerian economy can be classified broadly as the oil and the non-oil sectors. So aside this first classification, that is classifying it into three sectors, the primary, secondary, and tertiary, we can as well classify the Nigerian economy into the oil sector and the non-oil sector. The oil sector contributed 9.14% to total real GDP in the first quarter of 2019. The non-oil sector contributed 90.86% to the nation's GDP, higher than recorded in the first quarter of 2018, which was 90.45%, but lower than the fourth quarter of 2018, which was 92.94%. We're actually looking at the contribution of the two sectors, the oil sector and the non-oil sector, to the GDP, to the gross domestic product. The oil sector contributed 9.14% to the real GDP, meaning that when we look at the volume of goods and services produced in the country, only 9.14% comes from the oil sector, which means crude oil is just 9.14% of the volume of goods and services produced in the country, while the bulk of goods produced in the country is from the non-oil sector. When I say non-oil sector, you know what I mean. Putting together other sectors of the economy and having oil sector to be separate. So, in 2009, in the first quarter, that is between January and March 2009, oil contributed just 9.14% to the gross domestic product, while the non-oil sector, other sectors of the economy, contributed 90.86%. Meanwhile, at the end of 2018, non-oil sector contributed 92.94%, but that has reduced by 2019 first quarter to 90.86%. Now let's look at the economy based on the first three sectors we have talked about before. That is the primary sector, the secondary sector, and the tertiary sector. We shall start with the primary sector, and the first industry we are going to look at under the primary sector is the oil and gas industry. Oil industry acts as a basis of Nigeria's economy. Oil and gas accounts for about 10% of the gross domestic product of the country, and it provides about 90% of export earnings of the country and 70% of government revenue. So the oil industry is the basis of Nigeria's economy, meaning that the major revenue of the country comes from oil. Though from the previous paragraph, the first paragraph there, only 10% of the gross domestic product is from oil, but oil or crude oil is the major exports. It takes the major bulk of the goods exported. It's just 10% of the volume of goods and services produced, but it is the major goods exported. And it fetches the government a lot of money. Over 90% of our earnings from exports, that is over 90% of the revenue realized from exports, is from oil and gas industry. And that's why we say the oil and gas industry is the basis of Nigeria's economy. So Nigeria's economy is always affected by fluctuations in the price of crude oil, because it gets a large percentage of its revenue from crude oil, from oil and gas. Nigeria ranks the first country in Africa and the 8th country in the world in terms of oil exports. So we export a large amount of oil to other countries. We are the first in Africa as regards the quantity of crude oil, the quantity of oil and gas that we export, and we are the 8th in the world, the 8th largest exporter of crude oil in the world. Nigeria is one of the lead exporter of liquefied natural gas, accounting for 15.5% of our exports. So natural gas takes 15.5% of our total exports. Nigeria's first oil was drilled in 1958. A large part of the oil reserves is concentrated in the Niger Delta. In order to increase revenue, Nigeria has continued to increase oil production. But in the 90s, oil prices were quite low, which means since oil was first drilled in 1958, we've been increasing our production, we've been increasing the quantity of crude oil that we mine, that we export, and that has been fetching the government a lot of money, huge amounts of money. Bulk of our revenue has been from crude oil since then until the 90s. The price of crude oil in the international markets has started falling. So Nigeria produced 2.1 million barrels of oil daily as at first quarter of 2019. That is between January and March 2019. The Nigeria produced 2.1 million barrels of oil daily. That is, in a day, we are able to mine 2.1 million barrels of oil. Average daily oil production stood at 1.96 million barrels per day. So in an average, we produce 1.96 million barrels per day, which is lower than the average daily production of 1.98 million barrels per day recorded in 2018. So it means the volume of crude oil we produce as of 2009 is lower than that of 2008 by 0.02%. That is lower than that of 2018 as at first quarter. But presently, the volume of crude oil we produce is higher than the volume we produced at the end of 2018. Don't be confused. At the beginning of 2018, the quantity of oil we produce or crude oil we produce was higher than the quantity we produced at the beginning of 2019. But at the beginning of 2019, what we produced is still more than what we produced later on at the end of 2018. So we can say summarily is that the quantity of crude oil produced as at first quarter of 2019 is higher than what we produced at the end of 2018, which is on an average 1.96 million. But as at first quarter of 2019, we produced 2.1 million barrels of oil daily. but on an average, it is 1.96 million barrels per day. That is looking at other quarters. Since 1970, oil became the basis of the raw material base of the mining industry in Nigeria. What we are saying here is that oil is not the only mineral resource that we mine in the country. But since 1970, attention has been shifted from mining other mineral resources into mining crude oil. That is, we concentrate more on mining crude oil than other mineral resources. Before 1970, other mineral resources too used to be mined and exported, and they were also contributing to the GDP. But from 1970s, when attention has been shifted from them to from 1970, attention has been shifted from mining other mineral resources to mining basically crude oil. Though we still mine some other mineral resources, but their contribution to GDP is not so significant. Except for the recent time that activities in mining other mineral resources has improved. But before now, our attention is basically on mining crude oil since 1970. Oil deposits were discovered in offshore near the Niger River Delta and in Anambra River Basin. Main oil production areas are located around Port Harcourt in Niger Delta and in Ughelli. In 1979, Nigerians achieved a record level of oil extraction up to 114 million tons. That was at 1979. We were able to extract as much as 114 million tons. Nowadays, oil reserves are evaluated to be around 25 billion barrels. So presently, our oil reserve is 35 billion barrels. Our oil reserves presently is around 35 billion barrels. The oil sector contributed 9.14% to total GDP in the first quarter of 2019. The contribution of the oil sector to the volume of goods and services produced, all total volume of goods and services produced in the country is just 9.14%, around 10%. So it means the volume of goods and services produced in the country, oil takes just around 10% of it. Apart from petroleum, Nigeria's other natural resources include natural gas, tin, iron ore, coal, limestone, niobium, lead zinc, and arable land. These are other resources that Allah has blessed us with, aside petroleum. Petroleum exports revenue represent around 86% of total exports. So petroleum is about 86% of our total exports. That is, the bulk of our exports is from oil, as I was saying earlier. Crude petroleum and natural gas contracted by 2.40% in the first quarter of 2019. That is, the volume of crude oil that we usually mine reduced. Activity in mining crude oil reduced with about 2.40% in 2019. While quarrying and other minerals sector grew by 29.31% as at first quarter 2019. So this is a pointer to the fact that as at 2019, we are trying to shift attention back to production of other mineral resources, that is mining other mineral resources aside crude oil. So our activities in quarrying and mining of other solid minerals has grew by 29.31% as at first quarter of 2019. The next sector in the primary sector, or the next industry in the primary sector, is the agriculture industry. Four sub-activities make up the agricultural sector: the crop production, livestock, forestry, and fishing. In 2019, the federal government continued with its renewed focus on the agricultural sector in an attempt to diversify the economy away from oil. Nigeria is a country whose main focus or main activity for exports is crude oil. So since 2016, government has been putting in place measures to diversify the economy to ensure that the economy does not rely on revenue from crude oil only, because fluctuations in price of crude oil is really affecting the economy. Whenever the price of crude oil is low in the international market, it reduces the amount of revenue that will be generated by the government. So it's just like our economy is dependent on crude oil. So government is trying to correct this abnormality by trying to pay more attention to our culture sector in order to diversify the economy. And one of the efforts that government has put in place to do this is to close the border in order to increase food production in the country, especially the production of rice. The government wants us to increase our production of local of goods that we can make in the country in order to increase our production or food production in the country. So before the 70s, agriculture used to be the mainstay of the economy. Agriculture used to employ more than 50% of the labor force, and the bulk of our revenue used to be from agriculture until attention was shifted from agriculture to crude oil. Though we still export some agricultural products presently, but the contribution of agriculture to our total export is around 22%. Most of the things we export are crude oil and gas. So most of the things we export are from the oil sector. So back to the agriculture sector. The sector, which was neglected since 2016, became an option for diversification, owing to its vast potentials to drive a more sustainable economic growth in Africa's most populous nation in terms of job creation and revenue diversification. Presently, agriculture employs about 36% of the labor force. Agriculture employs about 36% of the labor force, which means most people that used to engage in agriculture are no longer engaged in agriculture. Agriculture used to employ more than 50% of the labor force, but now it employs just 36%. Only 36% of the labor force are into agriculture. Agriculture contributed 19.11% to nominal GDP during the first quarter of 2019. That's 2019, not 2009. Higher than the recorded contribution in the first quarter of 2018. So in 2019, agriculture contributed 19.11% to nominal GDP, which means the volume of goods and services produced in the country, 19% of it is from agriculture. Agriculture sector grew by 3.17% in first quarter 2019. So we can see that since the government is trying to resuscitate the agriculture sector has been growing. As of 2019, first quarter of 2019, it grew by 3.17%. Crop production under agriculture sector grew by 3.27%. Livestock under agriculture sector grew by 0.88% in first quarter 2019. So crop production remains the major driver of the agriculture sector. That is, what is most, how do I put it? The sector, the activity that prevails in the agriculture sector that contributes more to our agriculture sector is crop production. That is, we are more into crop production in our agriculture sector than the other three subsectors, which are forestry, fishing, and livestock. So crop production is the main driver of the agriculture sector. Crop production remains the major driver of the sector. It is evident as it accounted for 85% of agriculture GDP. That is, crop production contributes about 85% of the major output from the agriculture sector. That is, the total goods produced from the agriculture sector, 85% of them are crops. 5% of them is from crop production. Then we move to the secondary sector of the economy. Under that, don't forget we have the manufacturing and the construction industry. So look at the manufacturing industry. The manufacturing sector comprises of 13 activities. These are the things that make up, these are the activities that make up the manufacturing industry. We have oil refining, cement production, food production, beverages and tobacco, textile, apparel and footwear, wood and wood products, pulp, paper and paper products, chemical and pharmaceutical products, non-metallic products, plastic and rubber products, electrical and electronic, basic metal and iron and steel, motor vehicles and assembly, and other manufacturing. These are the activities that make up the manufacturing sector. Manufacturing sector grew by 0.81% in first quarter of 2019, which means the manufacturing sector is also coming up. Our manufacturing sector used to be very underdeveloped. It's not developed at all. And that's why the bulk of our exports are usually in their raw form. Most of the things we export basically crude oil. They are not the ones refined. But the bulk of our exports are in their raw forms, in their primary form. The agricultural products, the products even from agriculture that we export are not the refined ones. They are the raw ones. And even in the oil sector, which is the largest percentage of our exports, most of the things we export there are crude. We export basically crude oil. So our manufacturing sector is definitely not developed yet. But as at 2019 first quarter, our manufacturing sector grew by 0.81%. That is, the volume of goods and services produced by the manufacturing sector improved by 0.8%. In terms of this contribution of manufacturing sector to the GDP, it accounts for 9.8% of the real GDP in 2019. So as of 2019, so we can feel the effect, can feel the impact of the manufacturing sector on the gross domestic product. That is, from the volume of goods and services produced in the country as of 2019, 9.8% of it is from the manufacturing sector, which is higher than what we recorded in 2018. In 2018, its contribution was just 8.86%, but as of 2019 first quarter, the contribution of manufacturing sector to GDP increased to 9.8%. Now the construction industry. The construction sector grew by 3.18% in first quarter 2019. I hope you know what the construction industry is all about. Assembling of different parts of finished or semi-finished goods to make usable goods. So, for the construction industry, we have 3.8% growth rate in first quarter of 2019. It used to be 2.05% in 2018. So it means the construction industry is also growing, while the manufacturing sector grew by 0.81%. Manufacturing sector grew by 0.81%. The construction industry grew by 3.18%. And this has actually been the major growth in the industry, which reflected in the GDP in 2019. Now let's look at the tertiary sector, which is the sector that is actually coming up. In fact, more than 50% of the Nigerian labor force falls in this sector. Most Nigerians, some of them are small-scale traders, businessmen, and our communication and the entertainment industry is also growing very, very rapidly. So the tertiary sector is actually gaining is actually improving, and its contribution to the GDP is becoming noticeable. This sector provides professional and commercial services. It comprises trade, information and communication, housing and food services, transportation, banking, hotels, entertainment, tourism, the insurance companies, the transportation, anything service falls here. Anything service and trade falls here. Service, trade, and all activities that eat trade, they fall here. So we are going to look at the major industries in this sector. So we are going to look at trade. Trade sector grew by 0.85% in first quarter of 2019. Information and communication sector grew by 9.48%. You can see information and communication. Our communication system is actually improving. It's better than what it used to be. So information and communication sector grew by 9.48% in first quarter 2019. And its contribution to the GDP is 13.33%. Its contribution to GDP is 13.33%, which means of the volumes of goods and services produced in the country, 13.33% of it is from the information and communication sector. That is as at 2019. This is higher than what it used to be in the previous year. So this is where we are going to stop today. Inshallah, the next class will continue with the nature of the Nigerian economy. But before we go, let's look at what we have done today briefly. We started by categorizing the Nigerian economy into three sectors: the primary, secondary, and tertiary. And then we also learned that we can as well categorize it as oil sector and non-oil sector, and we have also looked at the contribution of the oil sector and the non-oil sector to the GDP as of 2019. While the oil sector contributed 9.1% to the GDP, the non-oil sector contributed 90.86% to the GDP as of 2019. We also looked at the sectors one after the other. We looked at the primary sector, which consists of the agriculture sector, the oil and gas sector, the forestry sector or industry, and the mining sector or industry. These are the sectors or industries that make up the primary sector. So we looked at the contribution of the major sectors there. We looked at the contribution of oil and gas. Oil and gas accounts for 10% of the GDP, and it provides about 90% of the total earnings from our exports. That is, the bulk of our export is from oil and gas. Then we looked at the agriculture. The agriculture sector, which consists of the crop production, livestock, forestry, and fishing. And we learn also that crop production is the major driver of the agriculture sector. Then we also learned that the government is trying to resuscitate the agriculture sector in order to increase its contribution to total exports as well as to the GDP. Though the agriculture sector is still the mainstay of the country, in the sense that the government earns a lot of money. Government generates a lot of money from agriculture. Though its contribution to total exports may not be so significant, it's around 22%, but its contribution to government revenue and the GDP is huge. The government is trying to increase the production of agricultural products in order to diversify its export base and its source of revenue. And since then, agriculture has been growing. It contributed 19.11% to GDP as of 2019, and it grew by 3.17% as at that same period. And we noted also that crop production is the major driver of the sector. That is, bulk of our agricultural production is crop production. And we looked at the secondary sector, which consists of the manufacturing and the construction companies or industries. We looked at the major activities that take place under the manufacturing sector, and we learned that the manufacturing sector grew by 0.8% in 2019, while the construction section grew by 3.18% as at that period. We looked at the tertiary sector. I told you the tertiary sector is actually growing. especially its communication and entertainment industry. And we looked at activities or subsectors under tertiary sector. And we looked at trade specifically, and trade also is growing. It grew by 0.85% as at first quarter of 2019, while information and communication sector grew by 9.48%. So this is where we are going to stop today. By next class, we shall continue, inshallah.